Hi, today we're going to concentrate the Littles Go Exploring. Super time. Tom and Uncle Nick were back with their family. Everyone talked at once. What happened? Where were you? Yes, but where were you? And the rocket went up. Whoosh, we heard a big bang. Then Granny threw a spear. Granny threw a spear. A cookie thing. Grandpa was there. He went down the brook. He never returned. After the noisy meeting, Mr. Little introduced Uncle Nick and Tom to some of the brook tinies. And this is Mr. Eddie Burns, said Mr. Little. We met him after running into his son, a wonderful swimmer with a pet turtle. Mr. Burns is a proud father of 20 children. 20, Tom, said Tom. Well, he looked at Lucy. I guess these kids were never lonely. Mr. Burns was a tall, thin man, and please call me Long Daddy, Mr. Little, he said. How my friends do? The Burns family had invited us to the lunch, said Mr. Little. A group of the youngest Burns children stood near their father. They nodded their heads. Uncle Nick looked around. Where do you live, Mr. Burns? He asked. I don't see any. We were just showing your family where we lived and you came along, Mr. Burns said. He pointed to the neighboring rocking cliffs. These rocks are full of caves. We live in them. Caves, Tom said. Whoa! They are limestone caves, Mr. Burns went on. They were made by water draining down the hill millions of years. It amazes me to think about it. Our homes were being prepared for us all the time before we got here. We were really very thankful. But aren't they damp? Asked Uncle Pete. All that water going through, my goodness. And Long Daddy Burns laughed. No, sir, he said. The kids were dry and snug and warm, you see. Years and years ago, our forefathers came here. They changed the way the water flows. Now it goes around the rocks and misses the caves. Except for some that we let go through for cooking and washing. Where is Mrs. Burns? Asked Mr. Little. You'll meet her at lunch, said Mr. Burns. As soon as we saw your boat, we sent word to her that we would have company for lunch. Mr. Burns began walking. Come meet the rest of the family. Mr. Burns led the way. He walked toward one of the many caves in the rock ledges. Just then something fell above it, splashed in the brook below. Uncle Pete ducked. What was that? What? Was that a rock? He asked. Long Eddie Burns laughed. That was one of the children diving, he asked. Uncle Pete limped over to the edge of the rock ledge. He looked down. Why, we are the last 6 feet above the brook, he said. Then he looked up at the overhead ledge. And did he dive from higher up? He certainly did, Mr. Burns said. Everyone can dive from where we are standing. Mr. Burns pointed to a branch of a tree above the brook. Now, if you would like to see a really high dive, keep your eyes on the neighbor. Sally Skies, she's in that tree. The Littles looked up at the tree. I don't see her, said Lucy. There, I see her. On that flat branch, said Tom. Way up there. I don't believe it, said Granny Little. I'm not looking, said Mrs. Little. She closed her eyes. Baby Betsy in her mother's arms reached up and touched her face. That's a 10-foot dive, Uncle Nick guessed. The tiny diver leaped from the tree. The Littles clapped when the girl hit the water. It was a clean, beautiful dive. It must take years for practice to be able to do that, said Mr. Little. All brook tinies begin swimming before they learn to walk, said Mr. Burns. We love the water. We live in the water a lot. We get much of our food from the water, as you will learn at lunch. The tiny man entered the cave. He was followed by his children and the Littles. If the Littles were expecting to see a dark and gloomy cave home, They were surprised and said they found the Burns home to be a warm, friendly-looking place. First, there was plenty of light. Beeswax candles were burning everywhere. The candlelight reflected off smooth cave walls. The walls were bright with many different colored rocks. In the largest room of the cave, the Lils met Mr. and Mrs. Burns and the rest of the family. There were aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents. There are even some great-great-grandparents. Brooke Tinies lived to be very old. Everyone sat at two long tables. Tom and Lucy sat with the Burns children. They told each other stories of tiny life. The food was delicious. Everything was wild and came from the brook or neighborhood. First, they had celebrated waffles and honey. There was wild rice, crisp salad, and the tender sweet roots of the yellow gutsberry plant. There were served dishes of crayfish, mussels, and fish tiny truelings. Everything came in the dishes and pots and made of the clay found on the banks of the brook. Voices carried well in the rock cave. People spoke softly. Even the hard of hearing had no trouble hearing what was said from the long table to the other. After eating, Mr. Burns rapped on the table for attention. He stood up and talked for a long time. He said, "How wonderful it was to visit with Grandpa's little relatives. He thought Grandpa was a fine man. He hoped he was safe somewhere." After that, Mrs. Burns rapped on her table. So she stood up and walked for a long time. Mostly she told about the danger of going down the brook. She tried to talk the Lils out of making the trip. Mr. Lil saw there was a thing to make specialists at brook tiny meals. So he rapped on the table and stood up. "Good, let's hear from Will Lil," said Long Eddie Burns. Mr. Lil said, "I suppose you would all like to know what it is to live with big people." He talked for a long time about the bigs. Then he said how much he liked the brook tiny way of life. He said, "Living in the beautiful dark woods and swimming in the time must have be very good for all of you. You look great." Finally, Mr. Little said they would go ahead with their plan to explore the brook. After lunch, we'll start out again, he said. "We have come this far safely. We have a good boat, and we are going to finish what we have started. It's our duty to find out what happened to Grandpa Lil, and we're going to do it." Everyone stood up and applauded. Next, Uncle Pete stood up and made a speech. He talked about his favorite subject, the mouse invasion of 35. He went on and on, going over every part of the story. Finally, when some of the older brook tinies fell asleep and the children began sneaking out of the room, Mr. Little stopped him. "It's time to finish, Uncle Pete," he said. "We really have to be leaving." To finish up, Uncle Pete made a toast. Everyone raised a mug of apple cider. "Here's to the friendship of all the tinies in the big valley," he said. "To house tinies, tree tinies, wood tinies, and especially to brook tinies. Trash tinies and especially to brook tinies." Everyone clapped and cheered. The echo of applause bounced off the cave walls. They almost defended everyone. Everyone except Granny Little, who was hard of hearing anyway. She liked it. "I think my hearing must be getting better," she said. "Everything is so clear." Bye.